science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on the status of architectural thinking. I am in New York. It's February 2022 and I'm here for the opening of the new South Asian Modernism show at MoMA, which features about 8 drawings of my father, Aditya Prakash, his architectural drawings and a few photographs. And in this context, it is apposite for me to bring to you part 2 of my conversation with the architectural historian William Curtis. If you haven't heard part 1, which was 2 weeks ago, you should do that. But in any case, this conversation also stands on its own as Curtis details to us his experience of meeting and working with the well-known Indian architect Balkrishna Doshi, and details how he wrote his book on his life and work in the context of the broader narrative of Indian modernism in the world today. I hope you enjoy. As always, I would love to hear from you. Please reach out at vikram.prakash@gmail.com. Here we go.
Yes, I mean, during this 1983 trip where we were plunged into deepest India and staying in, absolutely remote places, and really through direct experience, trying to understand the language of ancient Indian architecture. And this is terribly important, this direct experience with sketches, with, visiting and revisiting. There was no academic agenda. This was truly traveling and wandering in the old style.
Mm-hmm. And I'm impressed you were doing like Indian buses and 12 hours in Indian buses. That's not for the faint-hearted.
No, we were tough in those days, and my wife still is. But we had a discipline where everything had to go into each a small bag, including film and notebooks.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we rumbled into Ahmedabad, and our plan was very much just to explore Ahmedabad and especially see the Corbusian buildings. Mm-hmm. However, it so happens I had, of course, knowledge of Doshi. Yeah, I had seen Doshi and Correa give a lecture together in tandem in the Graduate School of Design in 1974, and was very taken with their housing and Kachinjunga, et cetera, Right. And then occasionally Doshi would visit the schools in America, and he was giving a talk at MIT, I think in 81, and I was invited to have lunch with him. Uh-huh. And we hit it off. He said, if you ever come to Ahmedabad, do look me up. And I thought, well, that's nice of you to say that. But I mean, people say those things. Anyway, so I had a phone number in our bag. And we were installed in a not particularly pleasant hotel by the Sabramati. It was not the Park Hotel. It was some other sort of medium level joint.
So it wasn't the Karma Hotel, Charles Correa's hotel.
No, it wasn't the Karma. It was a much lesser hotel.
Okay.
And then I said to Catherine, do we bother Doshi? She said, look, there's no harm, So I went to the front desk and I said, can you place a call, please? Yes, sir. Yeah. And the person answered and said, hello, yes, I'll put you through to Mr. Doshi. And hello, Doshi here. I said, Mr. Doshi, I don't know if you remember me. My name is William Curtis. Of course I remember you. And I learned it even more when we got there, because actually a copy of Modern Architecture since 1900, the first edition, had arrived 3 days before, which happens to contain a chapter with Doshi's buildings in it already. Yeah. So this helped, I would say. Anyway, he said, well, where on earth are you? I said, well, we're in a little hotel by the river. Well, we can't have that. You must, I'll send a driver. You can come and have tea, but bring your bags with you. So 45 minutes later, ambassador car, boom, 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 turns up. And we hopped into the car. We drove out along western suburbs. And in those days, it got thinner and thinner with a few camels wandering around. And eventually this middle landscape, if you like, where Sangat is situated, Sangat being his studio, as you know, but I should say that for the reader.
But for the listeners, it's not like that anymore around there, around Satellite Road. It's jam-packed with stuff. But I remember what you're talking about. It was used to be an open road, and Sangat was off of that. Yeah,
Sangat was poised between country and city, which it is in its ideology.
Yeah.
Now, as you say, it's completely surrounded by huge flats, and I don't know, maybe another 10 kilometers of development to the west.
Quite
so.
True.
We arrived in this thing, which of course I had studied before, the low vaults, the diagonal route, the passage through past the jars and the vases, this low theatre of grassy steps. I mean, absolutely wonderful. And then we arrived, and there was this beaming figure of Doshi.
Yeah.
And he said, well, come in. And of course, we had some tea, and we sat in his office. We had the picture of Corbusian always there, his guru.
Yes.
And he said, "Look, I'm thrilled that you've looked me up. I do remember you very well, and your curiosity about India. Tell me what you've been doing." I said, "Well, we've done this, we've done that." Oh, wow, my goodness, that's fantastic. How terrific! Listen," he said. "Don't waste your money on a hotel. At the back of Sangat, we have a little apartment with 2 low beds on concrete rafts. You'll be happy there, and save the money to hire drivers to go off and look at things around, such as Modera, the great 11th century temple.
Incredible temple, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the way it started, and we just totally hit it off. It was a wonderful sympathy, you could say. And the same with Catherine.
Yeah.
And he said, "Look, you're here. I want you to meet the family. I want you to spend, we have to discuss things whenever we can." So we were drawn into the Doshi tribe just like that. And it was wonderful. And there'd be long discussions out at Sangat, but there was also going home in the evening, having delicious vegetarian meals. And one evening we went into the garden. He said, "I want to record you talking about how you think you can learn, the modern architect can learn today from something like the Elephanta cave, which you have talked about endlessly, because I was bowled over by Elephanta."
Yeah.
I said, it's the whole problem of absorption and transformation. Of course, I mean, Mr. Doshi, don't call me Mr. Doshi, call me Doshi.
Yeah.
And these were just wonderful. So here I had, if you like, the perfect person who was the living link between the force of Corbusier and the depth of Corbusier and the philosophy of Corbusier and the depths and depths of Indian tradition. And this was walking example was Doshi. This is exactly what he was about. And so this sort of hit the nail on the head for me and for him. So that's the way this all started.
Right. So you're sitting in Sangat, and you're sitting in his home, this beautiful modernist home. And you must be lecturing also at CEP. Did you do a lecture or two at CEP at that time?
No, but curiously enough, now this is something that may sort of astonish you. We were actually based in Bangkok for this 6 months, I think I mentioned. So India was a big piece. It was like 2.5, 3 months, but we had also traveled up country in Thailand. Eventually we traveled around Indonesia. It was a total immersion in Southeast Asia. And the following year was Sri Lanka, but not that year. So there we were in India, having been in India for about, 5 or 6 weeks in Ahmedabad. But just before leaving, despite the fact that our bags were supposed to be very light, I had put a few slides of the Parliament building in Chandigarh and of the Parliament in Bangladesh. And I had no idea irrationally why on earth I would overcharge my bag with that, but I did. So when it was not CEPT, it was Doshi himself said, since you're here, we'd love somehow for you to share your ideas with invited guests.
Yeah.
I said, well, I mean, how do you mean? Well, could you give a talk of some kind?
Yeah.
I said, actually, I could. And I could even give a talk, strangely enough, about those two buildings which obsessed me, one which I've seen 3 years ago, the other which I still haven't seen, but will see eventually, and have written about in notably, Perspective or here or there. And he said, what a wonderful idea. So it was set up on the grassy steps at night, and I don't know, 30 or 40 people turned up with a projector, sort of in someone's lap, And I started off and talked about why I thought these were such profound works of architecture, the ideas behind them, the symbolism, the this, the that. And then about halfway through the talk, there was a smell of roasting meat. And I thought, what? I mean, these are vegetarian people. What is this? And then one of my favorite slides caramelized because a mosquito had got into the lamp. So there was a cooked mosquito in the center of this. And anyway, among the people there was Anant Raje, who I met for the first time, who I think was director of the school at that time. And afterwards, we all pushed off to a quality restaurant. You remember these?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Semi-Western style.
Yeah.
And of course, he was a real meat eater. He had what he called a sizzler, And I just have to say that it was immediate with everybody. There was a feeling of coming home.
Right. I can imagine. I can totally imagine. In so many registers, it must feel like a coming home. I mean, it's India, it's these fantastic modernists, but then there's also the presence and memories of both Kahn and Corbusier and the entire sort of high modernist milieu of patrons and the Sarabhais and so on. Did you meet the whole community?
Eventually, not all on this first occasion, but of course, among the first things that was done was arranging for us to see all four Corbusier buildings, which included the Sarabhai compound. But we met Manorama, yes. She was like the sort of grand duchess, inside. And in fact, it was wonderful having her personality in those vaulted spaces, it sort of went together. I was absolutely captivated by Sarabhai, the kind of invisibility of this house,
incredible house, incredible. It's just a beautiful house.
And intangible, you can't quite say what it is. The Shodan I was a little more hesitant about, found it a little bit sort of overdone, but very powerful. Mill Owners Association, I was just not for a loop. I mean, I think this is Corbusier on top form.
Absolutely. It's a tour de force.
Not a centimeter out of place. And of course, having been brought up on Carpenter Center.
Sure. There's an amazing discussion.
Cousins, but I'll still give the prize to the mill owners. And then the museum, which was pretty knocked about, but it was still, of great interest. So there was all of that. Then there was discovering Khan IIM, which was another sort of knockout, and spending time with Raji over there. But in the background, there were these constant explorations of the mosques. As I told you, I was interested in, many levels of Indian tradition and the architecture of the so-called Sultanate period, which is pre-Mughal, was fairly new to me. And that was the first exposure to that in Gujarat, and how powerful it was. And then there were the stepwells, the things you know. So it was, a strong, very strong mix. I guess we spent about a week or 10 days hanging around in Ahmedabad and camping at the back of Sangat.
Fantastic. So let's get into it a little bit. I mean, of course, your book is there, but Doshi has, greatly learned and schooled in the Kahn and Corbusier schools. But how would you connect and contrast his absorption and transformation of Indian history compared to, let's say, Corbusier or Kahn? I mean, what is your sense of the discourse here?
This is complex, I think, and not easy to really pin down. I mean, first of all, Corbusier's interest in the past is well enough known, and he was very quick to react to certain things when he first came to India. The most obvious being the Jantar Mantar,
right.
This powerful thing which kind of transforms into his own Jantar Mantar on top of the parliament. But that's a little bit obvious.
Right.
Actually, there's very strong evidence to show that he studied intensively the plans of the Elephanta Cave.
Elephanta caves? Really?
Elephanta Cave, yes. Which you have the primary axis, then a cross axis, the Garbhagriha, a chamber, and a processional route. It's not obvious, but there are echoes, you see?
Yeah.
But I think it's silly to be too precise. I think he absorbed, everything. Of course, we know he was fascinated by mud villages. He was interested in Pinjore. He was interested in Mughal tradition, a lot of things. Khan also had the most extraordinary radar for picking up things in tradition. And now I think that there's more of that in Bangladesh, in that building, than there is in IIM. Rajay would like to say it's something to do with Mandu, but I think that's more in Rajay's mind than the thing. But the idea of citadels, the kind of weave of courtyards of traditional cities, things like that, on that level, I think there are resonances. Now, with Doshi, when I did that book, I actually plunged into his diaries and his private papers, and it was very, very interesting to see him sort of rediscovering India, if you like, when he came back from being in France. He worked with Corbusian for 4 years. And I think it's not, direct, but buildings like the Indology, which I still admire very much, obviously has a lot to do with things in the Ahmedabadi tradition, with even some of the kind of the tectonic values, if you like, of the buildings in Sarkej or whatever. But it becomes more sort of overt in Sangat. You see, I think things like the School of Architecture with this flowing spaces, all those ideas about village space, communal space, spaces between, were on the one hand, his reading of Indian reality, if you want, and its complexity. On the other hand, it's things that were in the air, in the discourses of Team 10. There's often this sort of two-way thing between international discourses and a reading of a local kind, in the case of Doshi, in fact, in the case of many architects. When he got to Sangat, it was a much more, would I say, self-conscious excavation of the past. But there are many pasts in that building. It's full of resonances. There are all the things which, he talks about subterranean temples, things that interest him. He talks about the diagonal search, but those are all Corbusian features as well. They're all things which are there. He talks about the in-between spaces of the Indian village, the interest in craft, water channels and so forth and so on. But, I did a piece actually about 3 years ago, just before he got the Pritzker actually, where I talked about a whole other set of buried agendas in that building to do with Taliesin West,
Really?
Absolutely. Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin West, the diagonal.
In Phoenix.
Yes. In Scottsdale.
Yeah, I've been there. Many times. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Think about it. There's platforms, the tent hovering over a space, and the idea of a sort of monkhood of people coming together, and a sisterhood, a nunhood, towards an ideal. Now, I tested that idea with him about a year ago. He said, absolutely. He said, when I had my, he won a grant from, what's it called in Chicago? People
Graham Foundation, yeah.
Correct. And he traveled around the States. And when he came to Taliesin, he was totally transfixed. And he has his notes where he says, I loved it because it's a kind of non-building. It's a kind of non-building, a field. Yeah. And this was very much in my mind when I designed Sangat. So,
right. Yeah, and it also, Taliesin has the levels and the sunken spaces as well. Yeah.
It has the sunken spaces, the kiva, the ritual, the echoes of pre-Columbian antiquity, of the ancient indigenous Indian societies, and of course it's the crudeness of the material, which is almost like a sort of natural slurry, which with boulders.
And it feels that finish does feel like all the tile that Doshi used. It's
yes,
tile.
That's right. And the concrete with the scraping and so forth.
Yeah,
it's trying to be somewhere between the industrial and the craft. The whole thing with
except Taliesin sits in this wide openness, right? I mean, whereas
obviously,
Sangat is very much a bounded plot.
It's a bounded plot, although in the early days you could see right across the road for miles. I remember living in it and seeing that. So there's that. But there's also, he was obsessed with his time in the monastic corridor of Le Corbusier's atelier in Paris. This long, narrow space with Corbusier at one end. And, tick, 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 tick. And I think also Alto's, studio at Tilimaki with the outdoor theater. So there's a synthesis of many, many things. And he had also seen the Vissa Vassef art center outside Cairo with mud vaults. So it's a very rich mixture of ideas which are pulled together into this nonetheless very tight design. And of course, way in the background are Corbusier's vaulted solutions of all kinds.
Of course, yeah. From Joule and so on, yeah.
Even earlier, the unbuilt project for Churchill, North Africa, which of 1942 with the vaults and again, the kind of flirtation with an eternal rural architecture of the Mediterranean in that case. Or on the other hand, the importance of Kahn's vaulted solutions. It's like a sort of broken version of a Kahnian vaulted scheme.
Okay.
So, and in the earliest project, there were many more vaults up at the front than as well as at the back. So it's there's a degree, I don't want to overstress this, but there's a degree of a kind of hidden autobiography in that project. And yet it is what it is. It's something that you experience when you come in through the gate. There's this mysterious, vault with
alcove,
what's going on here? And then you're forced to go left in this valley with the jars picking up the diagonal view. And then there's this lovely little waterway, which is like a comma, which is like a quotation from the milliners, actually, foreground. And then that pulls you up on the diagonal and round to the back and then back into the building. And he said to me many times, Corbusier always said, don't enter a building directly, go around and go around the back, so on and so on and so on and so on. So, I got to know this place very, very well by actually living in it, getting to know it in different weather conditions, in a dust storm in the summer where you feel very protected underground. Of course, it's partly a reaction to the extreme climate, the subterranean features of it. I remember one of the dramatic moments, which I describe in the book, actually, which is in 87. I wrote the first version of the book in early 87, went back in the summer of 87, and was there also for the beginning of the monsoon, which was very, very late. And every day people were watching the television, they're worried about it. What's happening? Why isn't the monsoon coming? And I was having dinner with the Doshis, and I said, well, bye-bye, see you tomorrow. Took a taxi, and halfway along Thartej Road, there was a thumping noise, and I thought, God, someone's attacking the car. It was the rain. And the people ran out into the streets, women in their saris, and just welcomed the rain. It was one of those great Indian moments, And then I got back and was dropped off and raced from the front gate, but was still totally drenched in the 50 meters between there and the little apartment at the back. But when I looked out, there were camel trains going by with the lightning flashing behind them. It was one of those Indian moments,
So how long did you stay in the apartment at Sangat?
Well, I stayed many times. I think in that period when I was writing the book, I must have been about 3 or 4 weeks, I guess. It was a kind of, I would have my breakfast there and then, hang around in the garden until people turned up. It was a very interesting period.
Uh-huh. So, what is your sense of the, I mean, I've read your book. I'm not sure everybody who's listening may have read your book on Doshi. But what is now, in any case, looking back, what is your sense? I mean, Doshi is still active. I mean, it's unbelievable. He's very active and in good health and doing well.
Indeed.
Yeah. So we all know the sort of the Corbusian years and early years of Doshi. But how would you describe the development of his thinking and his career and work, let's say mid-80 onwards? Like, what do you think is the progression there?
Well, you see, immediately after Sangat, there was the Gandhi Labour Institute, which used the same language to a degree, and some of the same basic concepts. When you follow Doshi's later work, there's a lot more fragmentation. It's less tight, I would say, altogether than that early period. And I think that with Doshi, one of the things that drew me to him was not just the architect, but it was the thinker and the person who was trying to read on many levels Indian society with the help of the Vastu Shilpa Foundation, masses of research projects on typologies of old towns, trying to conceive a new urbanism that was like the project for the new Jaipur, which was a kind of hybrid of Chandigarh and of traditional Hindu urbanism as conceived in the 18th century in Jaipur. All very interesting, but it never...
Fabulous project. Here, I'll show you. I have one of his prints right here.
There we go.
Yeah.
No, it's a marvelous thing.
Yeah.
So, but when you get to the Diamond Workers Union building or whatever that was called, this great fragmented thing, I think there are problems of scale that enter in. So, it turned into a different practice as well with others involved, and so it goes on. But I think that to me in addition to the architecture, there's let's say a value system operating in Doshi, which is of great importance. I mean, in a deeper sense, he was a humanist, if you want to call him that, in a sense of the spiritual, a sense of what counts in the long term in society, and wanted to, quote unquote, produce a better world through architecture. This is what it boils down to.
Right. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I totally agree with you that for Doshi, it was a complete philosophy, still a complete philosophy, a complete search about how to be in the world.
That's it.
And how to be an absorber of everything, right? I mean, he is such a palimpsest of a person and an architect. Everything kind of absorbs into his memory from ancient stories of his own house, his father-in-law's house. He always talks about, and then of course the Doshi, not the Corbusier, Raje, Corbusier, Khan, that whole ethos. But all the time you get a sense that he's searching. He's always turning over stones, trying to look for more things. A very curious and open mind.
Oh, definitely. And there's also the importance of drawing, exploring things through drawing. He would claim that all the things you describe are among the things that inspired him in Le Corbusier, because Corbusier had his eyes open at all times to everything,
right,
and was constantly, let's say, involved in a metamorphosis. And that gets me to another aspect of our time in Ahmedabad. We went back in '84 in the spring. Spring, I mean, like February or whatever. Arriving in Delhi, going first of all to Jodhpur, and then finding a driver and driving around the Thar Desert in dust storms, which was quite an experience. Going to Jaisalmer, of course, which was a pilgrimage place for a whole generation of people looking for a new sense of containable urban space, complexity. I mean, especially Rajrewal, but I mean,
of
others.
course, yeah.
And then, cutting across to Ranakpur, which is still, to me, one of the highest points of Indian architecture, the great Jain temple at Ranakpur. And then finally down into Ahmedabad, where we received an exhibition, which I had first prepared and shown in the Carpenter Center at Harvard when I taught there, which was called Fragments of Invention, the Sketchbooks of Le Corbusier, which was exactly what it says it is. And it was blow-ups from pages of these sketchbooks with some of the original sketchbooks in that case. And it was all about metamorphosis, about observation and transformation, observation and transformation. And the centerpiece of it was the Parliament building in Chandigarh, because I had all these fantastic sketches showing him, coming up with those ideas and the cosmology of them, and the moon and the sun and the this and the that. And I even had a wonderful, the red section, brought from Paris. And well, when this came to India, we couldn't have all these, things from the Fondation, but we set it up in the Hatta Singh Center. Everything arrived very, very late, and I put it all together at the last minute with 3 carpenters. And, the last nail went into place, and then we opened the doors and in poured the sarabais and the rustle of saris, and oh, it's wonderful, and so forth and so on. So, this aspect of Corbusier, which I discussed very much with Doshi from my point of view as a historian. I've been interested in that going way back to my work on Carpenter Center 10 years before. It really it chimed with him very much so, because that's certainly the way he looked at the world. Definitely.
Right. Yeah. Before we move on from Doshi, how do you read the Gufa? How do you read the Hussain Doshi Gufa? That's truly a very different kind of a work, is it not?
Yes, it is. I'm less keen on it. It has a kind of intriguing theatricality about it. But I think I said yesterday that one of the things that intrigues me about that generation is when they're still in high tension, breaking away from the quote unquote masters. It's in that high tension that they achieve their best work. I mean, that Sangat has freedom, it has all the things we can discuss, but it also has a tremendous sense of order, And so, I'm a little bit less keen on this subterranean grotto. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, I must admit, I quite like the building. I remember, I think I was, I don't know what I was doing at Sangat. I didn't stay in the apartment, but I was working on some interviews with Doshi when he was designing the Gufa. And I remember him playing with this mud.
Yes.
He had this box and he had this mud, and he was putting his hand in there, and he was crafting it all with his hand out, and he was making it. And he was like, he would always say, come, see, I have, this is what is happening.
Watching around. Yeah.
It was
a sense of play. Yeah.
An immense sense of play, like a amazing childlike innocence to it, And here was this Doshi, and with all the credentials and what a history. But I was so fascinated by how playful he was in the design of it.
Yes.
Kind of really just having fun.
Yes.
And in the end, it's a unique project in my estimation. Like it's kind of like I'm going to open this door and see what happens. And he looked at it, did something over there, and then moved on and did other things. But it's quite an experiment. It reminds me very much of the old, like if you take one of the Ajanta caves or even the Elephanta caves, you take it and then you put it through kind of like a morpher of some kind of those funny mirrors.
Yes.
And it distorts and reconfigures, and suddenly it has some catenary curves and other things happening in it. And it becomes something else. That's how I like it.
No, you can put it that way. Of course, there's always Gaudi somewhere in the background.
Of course, Gaudi.
Including in Sangat. Yeah, no, all you say is true. It's still a matter. I suppose I've just got very hooked on Sangat. That's sort of anchored
Sure.
in Sangat and keep coming back to it. And gets to another point, which is, since we talked about books yesterday and your book and assembling it, and well, one of the things I found fascinating was, working in the garage, finding all these bits lying around, putting together an archive, and then getting the Centre Canadien d'Architecture interested, and all of that is terrific. Well, doing the book on Doshi was quite an adventure, because while I did the text and all the text for the individual projects, and then actually added at the last minute something which I reread recently. I'm just going to look it up again. Yeah, author's postscript, The Future of Indian Architecture. It's absolutely worth reading because some of it was uncannily correct. This is written on a dining room table in July the 1st, 1987, I think, or whenever. So the book was largely completed as a text in the summer of '87 when I went back to India in the heat. But the design kind of came to a halt. It's things not sure what had happened exactly in the autumn. And so when I came back in the winter, I expected to see the book, and it was, there were 2 chapters designed. And anyway, I won't go into details, but that evening I was back in Delhi at some fancy party, and was introduced to a very elegant young man called Aman Nath. And Aman said, "Oh, I've heard all about you, William, and there's a sort of Delhi society, but you look very troubled." I said, "Well, I am troubled." He said, "Well, why are you troubled?" I said, "Well, I've just been in Ahmedabad, and I've written this book about Doshi, and I thought it was all designed, and in fact, it's not designed, and I don't know what to do." He said, "Well, I'll design it." I said, "What?" He said, "Yes, I'd be happy to do that with you. That would be a wonderful project." And he did.
Yeah, beautiful book. Yeah.
Anyway, we did the design on a kitchen table in Golf Links Road, and with those very high quality black and white prints that you could get in India, and eventually put the whole thing together. And there was a nice, well, this was, in this period, by this later part, there's another element in the story, which is that my father-in-law had been appointed as U.S. ambassador to India.
That's the amazing part of it. Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, you see, my India was, there years before, and it was, of course, a more modest India when it came to places to stay. But he was given the post of India in late, early '86, I think it was, and
by Reagan. Reagan was,
oh Christ, I have to tell you.
I'm sure it's Reagan. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
sorry to put it this way.
Yeah,
he was a career diplomat. It was usually not a career diplomat, but a political appointee. And he set to work, and of course, it meant there was the access to the residence. And there was a bungalow at the end of the garden designed by the Moynahans, so that when we had a child, we could go and spend time there. And then I would be off in Ahmedabad working on things. So this introduced another dimension to the whole, the whole experience of being there, which, you can imagine. And also it meant we were in Delhi quite a lot. So while in Ahmedabad, I developed, of course, a tremendous friendship with Anant Raje, and a great admiration, by the way, for his work, which is now under threat too at IIM, some of it.
Right.
I also got to know a lot more about what was going on in Delhi, and became very good friends with Raj Rewal, who I'd already written about. So all of this added other, dimensions to the time in India.
Yeah. So, if we may return a little bit to the topic we touched on in our previous conversation. After all this, you sort of returned to Europe for a decade and really got involved and wrote, amongst many things, on the work of Enrique Miralles and Carmen Pinos. I never met either of them. I have met Benedetta later on. I went to the office a few times, and I am absolutely mesmerized buy their work. And I remember Benedetta telling me that Corbusier was it for Miralles, and his journey to India and to Chandigarh was like a major pilgrimage the one time he traveled over there. So I'd be very interested in, I know the essays in Croquis. What drew you to Miralles, and what were
Well, let me say this. It was Miralles was just one among 15 or so Spanish architects that I dedicated quite intense texts to.
Right.
I became extremely interested in Spanish modern architecture in the late 80s, when my book was Modern Architecture, the first edition, was translated into Spanish. And spent time in Spain at that time. I wrote a monograph on Carlos Ferreter, the Barcelona architect in '89. Wrote a major text about De la Sota, the architect from the 50s and 60s. So this was a kind of flowering of interest in a very rich period. The 80s was a very rich period in Spanish architecture, and indeed in Portuguese architecture. And eventually the people from El Croquis contacted me and they said, we're so interested in your approach, perhaps we can collaborate. So Miralles and Pinos was one, but then there was Juan Navarro Baldeveg, then there was Moneo, then there was Caesar, then there was et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So
why this fascination with Spain in particular?
Well, because there was such strength to this work. It was fresh, inventive. I never write about anything unless I find it moving.
Yeah, of course. What's the point?
It has to have a kind of emotional charge. But when you encounter something like the Palacio de Congresos in Salamanca with its floating dome by Juan Navarro Baldeveg, or Merida, the museum by Moneo, this was a very fertile period in Spanish architecture. And I was therefore interested in trying to chart it. And one of the things about El Croquis was I didn't like the kind of mugshot, star system aspect, but the quality of their publication,
very high,
for showing you, how buildings were, designed and put together, and the freedom one was given editorially, made it a very good way to sort of produce a prehistory. It's not quite history. It's not just criticism, but a series of reflections in depth on these various architects. It didn't stop there. I did one on Ando. I did one on Herzog de Meuron when they were really interesting, which was in the 90s, rather less so since, I would say. So there was a momentum which may have started with Miralles and Pinos, but it was especially the Igualada Cemetery.
Yeah.
But it was not just them.
Got it. But would you describe Miralles and Pinos as part of this pantheon of flourishing in Spain at this time, or would you single them out in any way?
Well, you see, in the end, I think when we talk about the evaluation of architecture, we have to talk about buildings rather than oeuvre or personalities or whatever. And I still rate the Igualada Cemetery very high. In fact, it's no accident that I used it to almost the last building in the third edition of Modern Architecture since 1900, which was published in 96. You see, the way I tend to work is I go out into the world and I'm, bowled over by a building or whatever, and then there's a reflection, then probably there's a text. But then later, there's the question of integrating it into the big story. And when I did the third edition of Modern Architecture, I said yesterday, the second edition was done in 87 with just an addendum, but which already included Sangat, already included, the Forestry Commission building by Rajay, it included something by Charles, can't remember what it was, but I mean, India was woven with a whole lot of other things.
Right.
I'd done an article in Architectural Record called Contemporary Transformations of Modern Architecture, which deliberately cut across all frontiers, which was published in 89. Well, this attitude was carried through. But then when I did the third edition, I exploded the book and added 7 new chapters and integrated India in all kinds of ways, and also integrated my discoveries of Spain. Yeah. And that's the way I try to work, is from It's not kind of just looking up, catalog. It's often very much from the gut.
Right.
When I saw the Maravillas Gymnasium by De La Sota in 1989, I thought, wow, what a masterpiece! I never knew about this. So there's this very visceral, direct attitude behind these texts, if I can put it that way. It was the same with India. It was the same with my attraction to the best of the work in India.
Okay, so as we are moving towards the final part of this conversation, so let's talk about the present. Let's talk about your thoughts on where architecture is today in this kind of, whatever you want to call it, globalized period, with big star architects practicing around the world, huge concentration in East Asia and the Middle East. What are your thoughts about architecture today and where it's going?
Well, it's going in many, many directions at once. I mean, you can't, for 1 second, posit a single line. And this is a real challenge in terms of evaluation. What do you think is significant? What do you not think? And also, there's a tremendous surplus of information now. This is whereas I was going on a sort of lack of information in the early 80s, now there's just an endless bombardment of images, etc. So rather than get involved in dropping names, if I may not,
Please.
I would say it's obviously a pluralist situation, that the issue of architectural quality always shines through. It transcends matters of style. It transcends matters of ideology. I wrote a piece way back, published in ARK, the Finnish thing, which is called the Taking the Long View. I mean, the need when you evaluate buildings to perhaps appreciate their freshness, but equally appreciate when they incarnate in some manner longer term architectural values in their. So that's if I start on names, we never stop.
Right.
But of course, I'm following. All right. Well, then I can say that among the architects that have interested me a great deal in the last 15 years. More Spanish or Catalan architects, which is Aranda Pigem Vilalta, RCR, who produce amazing work in relation to landscape, abstract but very resonant, very poetic, very rigorous. They were given the Pritzker about 3 years ago.
Right.
Not that I care too much about the Pritzker, but there are people like this that pop up that have, that are the real thing. And I've actually written, quite a lot about that. But then there are old timers. I've just finished quite a long text about Lewiska, the very fine Finnish architect who did these wonderful churches in the 80s and 90s, and they're still doing fine work. So I try to keep an open radar as to what's going on in different parts of the world. And as I said before, I like to, as much as possible, say, well, that's interesting, but I want to go and experience it. I've got to walk through those spaces. I've got to know if that really comes off or not. So that's the way I would put it.
Fantastic. Well, I think we have come to the present. We have done a long journey. We have started in the late 70s, even the early 70s, and come to the present. What do you want to close this out with? What are your thoughts?
My goodness, what are my thoughts? Well, where India is concerned, full well from, we discussed this yesterday, and I think it's known. I've got quite involved in the whole problem of protecting modern heritage, the protection of modern heritage in India against the ravages of, laissez-faire economics, against all the different forces which can disrupt. When the Hall of Nations was pulled down by Rewal, this was really a tragedy of the first order. And then when it comes to the the quote unquote masters, I feel that their lessons are still there. You know, I never was interested in neo-Corbusian architecture or neo-Kahnian architecture. But I do feel that there's a long wave motion in history, you know, that some buildings are very short wave, others are medium wave, and then others are kind of long wave. They keep being rediscovered. Some years ago, I went back to Dhaka, Bangladesh for the first time in 25 years and discovered a generation who were deeply involved with Khan, but doing very inventive things with it in relation to the present. And I had sort of forecast that with the Chaitanya. You remember Chaitanya group?
Yeah.
I had a wonderful correspondence with Marul's Islam back then, and say, well, you know, all this will carry in the long term. But these are very idealistic positions in a world of extremely destructive forces, you know, and the kind of urban development and ecology and so forth. It's tricky questions. So I'm, you know, always interested in, and of course I do go back to, you know, I told you, the plunging into antiquity. I look at my notebooks a great deal of Indian temples, my photographs, and I'm thinking it's time to put an exhibition together. Gorgeous pictures of Fatehpur Sikri. Those things carry, you know, quote unquote, eternal messages as far as I'm concerned, you know. But, you know, every generation will look at them in a different way, no doubt, you know.
I'm sure. William, it has been such a pleasure.
Well, the same.
To connect and reconnect, and to have the opportunity to record these two detailed conversations with you, to share old memories, to recount the adventures of your life. And I just want to, on my own behalf, but also on behalf of a whole generation of historians and thinkers and architects, thank you for all the work that you have done, all the sort of inspiration that you have provided, and veritably for transforming the landscape of modern architectural thinking. I think that's not an exaggeration. I think your work and your thoughts have
thank you.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about it. Your book, Modern Architecture Since 1900, is still the standard text in every modern architecture course that I seem to run into. And all kinds of discourses have come out of it, and I have encountered them in many registers. And I never fail to tell whenever I'm in one of these conversations. Yes, I met William Curtis in 1980, well before even the first edition was published.
Yeah, right. Well, that's very touching. Thank you. I'm a lone wolf. You know, I'm not part of a university department or anything. I just plow on, and if the thoughts are communicated and they touch people and open eyes in some way, open minds, it's touching to me. So thank you very much for saying all that. But anyway, Vikram, we must remain in touch more often and not wait 15 years or 20 years each time.
I agree very much. We'll be sure to do that.
And I think that, you know, since you're saying nice things about my work, under no obligation at all, I think the book you've done on your father's work is really a tremendous achievement. You know, it's an achievement not just of documentation and of assembly of things, but of reflection on a person who's central in your life, but also an era in Indian architecture, and even in more than just India. So I think it's a very key book, and I'm sure it'll have a lot of interesting critical reactions, because it's come out into the public realm, and it's very finely produced too. You know, Mappin did a nice job there. So anyway, so well done, and I look forward to hearing more of what you and your generation have to say about the global. We haven't touched that word, but I will say this. I mean, I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but I was actually a little bit ahead of the pack on some of these questions. There was a very interesting PhD thesis written about modern architecture since 1900 by a lady called Macarena de la Vega de Leon. I'll send you the link, called Intertwined Histories, and she got it. This importance of the, intertwining of different societies, of periods, intertwined, and of course, the very much so about integrating the so-called developing world into the global picture and treating it in exactly the same manner as anything else. I mean, as something, well, no, that's not quite right. It's not exactly the same, but giving equal weight to major work from what were once called peripheral countries, but they were never peripheral to me. My center was always moving around peripheries, and my peripheries were always moving around my centers, even pretty early on, So this is all very interesting to me because the world we're in is very different, and there are younger historians looking at these things in new ways, which I'm interested to know about.
Well, perhaps in a little time, we'll have to record another conversation and start on the global.
Yeah, sure.
Well, let's do that.
This was great. Right. Very nice to see you again, and all the best.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.